For tonight's guest speaker, he is a longtime member, a former president, and John Sebastian earned his bachelor's degree in history from Judson College, now University, and his MA in public history from Loyola University. Two great schools. He's been an adjunct professor of history at Judson University, teaching world history, 1500 to the present, and U.S. history. More recently, he was a social studies teacher at Woodlands Academy of the Sacred Heart. He was a tour guide at Jubilee College Station, historic site outside Prairie, Illinois. A project-based researcher at the Pritzker Military Library in Chicago, and was a curator of the Fischer Farm historic site in Bensenville, Illinois. Currently, he's an experienced facilitator at the Arlington Heights Historical Museum, and he's also an education and program assistant at the Elmhurst History Museum. John, is there anything else I'm missing there? I mean, like, you're the book. Yes.
Thank you. Yes.
John. But I'll get to that. One thing too, I personally want to thank John, just for all the work that he does. Whenever there's something he's done with the roundtable, John volunteers. Doesn't nobody comes up to him. I mean, and all this kind of. He's always got good ideas, and he's always helping. He's helping with our venue. Whenever there's a job to be done, John steps forward. So I personally want to say thank you for that. Because of people like John that really make our roundtable a special place for all of us. We look forward to our meetings. It's always nice to see friends. So again, John is always a go-to person, and it does so unsolicited. Also, if I guess John found a few moments of free time somewhere, he also is an author on Bensenville, and it was published by Arcadia Press Series, Images of America. Without further ado, our guest tonight, John Sebastian.
I'm gonna get the lights too, John. Okay.
Huh?
I'm gonna get those lights.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you all for being here this evening. I really appreciate it. I had one email response. I won't say a name, who said he was still coming for his dinner reservation, not in spite of the speaker. So I appreciated the support. No, no, thank you all for being here, and I appreciate your support personally and your support of the roundtable. It makes it worthwhile. I have the faces to put to the names when I have to sit through meetings with hotel sales and marketing staff. That is not always the most fun experience of your day. Robin, though, I think does a good job, and she's been doing what she can advocating for us here, and I think this meal tonight, in terms of what she did. So I'm glad to do it. I want the best for the roundtable and want to see it continue. So, but thank you, and I'm glad, and I really want to thank Dennis for the invitation to speak here tonight. I really appreciate it very much, and it was an honor to speak at Milwaukee last night, and it is, of course, an honor to speak here to the Chicago Roundtable. So I'm going to speak tonight, since many of you were at Salt Creek in the spring. I wasn't going to give the same talk this evening. I did that one on the Northern Home Front more broadly. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more and get a little more specific to where we are. I am a public historian by training, and as you could tell tonight, I was doing the role of public historian. I was taking the money and being the speaker tonight at the same time. As Leslie will tell you, that's what a public historian does, right? I mean, so I'm in that role, and as you've heard me say this before, fascinated by the history of of place and what makes each place unique and special. As academics, scholars, we're often taught that all places are interchangeable now in a postmodern world in urban areas. Graduate, get your job, move off to the next urban area. But as we know in this room, that's not the case. Each place is unique. Each place is different. There are things that make it that way, and it has an identity of its own and a history of its own. And at Loyola University, to mention that since Dennis did, thank you. It was I was the fortunate experience of working under two professors there at the time, Dr. Kalinda Lee and Dr. Theodore Kiermansky, Ted Kiermansky, as many of you know. Sort of bringing that out of me. I think it was there a little bit, but bringing that out of me and, you know, getting me to look for those stories that are embedded in the place. What are the stories that are embedded in the place? And then telling those stories and wanting to explore that. I do also want to say that it's hard to believe, but it was 20 years ago I got my first experience in the public history field at Jubilee College State Historic site, immediately outside of Peoria, just northwest of the city of Peoria, if any of you have been there. And that's where I first gave tours and assisted with what was at the time the largest single weekend Renaissance fair in the nation at that time. Then my family, we moved back to the Elmhurst Bensenville area, and I walked into the Elmhurst History Museum, but this time to volunteer. And I don't know what Miss Leslie thought of me the first time I walked in there, if she remembers that. But I began sort of my career there in a sense. And I want to thank her for that opportunity at the very beginning. And I meant to bring my kepi that I still wear when I reenact, that you gave me that kepi at the museum. She walked into the research room. She had assigned me to research on the one-room schoolhouse. So all this stuff about Fischer Farm in my life that you always have to hear about, maybe we can trace it back here. No, she walked up to me. She was working on a script for the cemetery walk, and she was explaining to me about this one part. And I was like, that's great. I wasn't sure why she was explaining until she finally said, no, I mean, you're the one who's going to play that part. And we're like, what? I'd never done something like that before. So thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit about where we are. It's what I just said. Talk about this place, and this place has a history, and the people who were here, and we'll talk about during the Civil War and the impact, because I think the other thing is this: we think about history, and there can exist this divide in our minds that the real history happened somewhere else. It happened at Gettysburg, it happened in Philadelphia, it happened in Germany, it happened on the beaches of Normandy, but history happened here. And I know we can go to the shop and we can buy that plaque that says, you know, in 1897, nothing happened here. But I want to say that's not true. Something did happen here, right here. Maybe harder to see it, but that doesn't mean that this place doesn't have a history. And it doesn't mean that something as significant and as important as the American Civil War did not impact the place where we are here. And so I want to try to draw that out a little bit tonight. But I want to back up just a little bit. I promise, Mark, I won't go all the way back to the Tower of Babel as I've done before in providing context and the dispersion of the nations before we get to what we're studying. But the county of DuPage was only settled just 30 years, not even 30 years before the Civil War. It wasn't a county until 1839. As many of you are probably aware, the pattern of settlement in Illinois was from south to north. So the northern tier of Illinois still remained generally unsettled as late as going into the 1830s, and it still looked like this: 85% prairie and 15% forest or stands of oak, particularly bur oak and maple in this area predominated, but mostly prairie there, as you can see. And this is what it looked like. And this is inhabitants of this area still when settlers moved into this area. The animals that many of us are used to seeing, but also some other animals there, perhaps like the black bear and the wolf that you see there in the cougar. There was still an even bigger diversity and variety of animals that were roaming right where we are sitting, right where you are sitting in these chairs right now. You can try to forget this building and try to imagine this here. Of course, though, and again, I won't have time to go into this history, but just to at least acknowledge here that there were, of course, many different native nations that were living in this area, and that there was cultures that had risen and fallen long before any Europeans ever came to live in this place, and that the Council of the Three Fires with the Potawatomi was only the most recent of tribes to live in this particular area in northeastern Illinois. But you can see there was a whole number of native nations and tribes that ranged across this area. And as I said, the Potawatomi were just the most recent of those, which the earliest of white settlers would interact with, in some cases, Potawatomi that were still living in this immediate area of what would become Cook County, Lake County, DuPage County here in far northeastern Illinois, to give you a sense of what this place was like. But as we move forward here, who gets the credit with being the first settler to come into what is now DuPage County? Again, there was no DuPage County, but here we have Bailey Hobson, and there is his mill. There's his wife, Clarissa, from Georgia. He had come here from further east, but most recently from Indiana before he moved into what would become DuPage County, settling in the south part of what is now Naperville. And I went over there and found the stones over there, and I think Sean shares my affinity for trying to find these rare remaining vestiges of something in DuPage County to explore. There's a subdivision standing there now where the mill was, but along the park there, along the west branch of the DuPage is a marker for the mill that he established and built. And so as you can see, this is in March of 1831 that he moved in there. But our first real community or town is going to be Naperville, or Naper Settlement as it was called. These families, John Naper, Joseph Naper, their families, as well as a handful of others, about 50 people coming from Ohio most recently at that point, into what would be that southwest corner of DuPage County, and beginning to establish their community there near where Bailey Hobson had put together his mill. A little bit further east from there, across this south tier, gentleman by the name of Pierce Downer. And if you've ever had the privilege, or perhaps not privilege, of coming to the Downers Grove Cemetery Walk, you'll have had the opportunity to meet Pierce Downer. Now, can answer all your questions about my life at that time when you come to the cemetery. And of course, there's his house, which is still standing there, not far from that cemetery. In between there, we have Lisle. Again, these are all in Naper settlement in 1831. Pierce Downer came in May of 1832. Here you see in the fall of 1832 what would become Lisle. Gary's Mill is the other settlement. No, we don't have a town called Gary's Mill now. This was just to the north of Wheaton there. Erastus Gary, Jude Gary, and Orinda Gary, establishing a mill out there just to the north of that. And of course, and I won't take the time to go into this, I promise I'll keep moving forward, but obviously the one conflict remaining was with what's called the Black Hawk War, as Black Hawk and many of the other Sauk wanted to come back and reclaim some of their lands here in northern Illinois, but as you know, were ultimately forced out through the conflict and then the Treaty of Chicago to move west of the Mississippi River. But this was going on right at the same time, just as these first settlers are just beginning to come into this area. Remember, prairie, forest, some wetland coming in to create their homes from scratch in this place. But yes, I cannot leave this off, because at the other end of the county, of course, we have a place called Churchville. Maybe some of you are familiar with this, and I will claim to you and assert that yes, what you are looking up there at the top is the oldest extant structure in DuPage County, and quite possibly in all of northeastern Illinois. That is the original home built by the Fischer family in November of 1836. You can find me another structure that's dating before that in the city of Chicago, I'll accept it. There are some that are very, very close, but I don't know that there's necessarily anything still in existence prior to that date. The barn that you see below there in that picture, that is their oldest barn. That was built in the summer of 1837, making that as well, I believe, the oldest barn that's extant in northeastern Illinois there at Fischer Farm. But here you can see, and I'm sorry that got a little blurry at the bottom, but there you can see Henry Fisher and August Fisher. Conrad and Louisa Fisher came here. They had 3 sons. Conrad split. It was a very large claim. This would be most of what is the southern part of Bensenville and all of the northern part of Elmhurst, where their farm was. In between, back over there further west, of course, we have Wheaton. There's Warren Wheaton, Jesse Wheaton, And of course, he married Orinda Gary because she wasn't too far away. So, what begins some development here? Well, how about some dinner? So that's William Butler Ogden in Chicago, obviously. Some efforts to begin building a railroad here, a railroad that would lead west. They want to eventually connect to Galena. That's your one other city, town in northern Illinois, but it's all the way in the northwest corner due to the lead mining up there, and they wanted to create another route, right? Another means of transportation to get there. That's a picture of the Pioneer, the first engine to run on that track. It would be eventually laid. It was actually chartered earlier in 1845, but it took quite some time and passed through a couple different hands before there was enough money raised to even begin laying track. Track was begun laid out of the city in the fall of 1848, and they made as far as the Des Plaines River, and then they had to stop and were seeking for more money. Ultimately, the tracks would be laid in 1849 across much of what is DuPage County. But in the meantime, that line, if you're familiar with it, the Metro train is still there. It enters DuPage County right along North Avenue where it enters Elmhurst. Downtown Elmhurst, the Metro train station is there, but you know that by the time you get to the western end of the county, that particular train line has dipped far to the south, passing through Wheaton, much further south. Well, that's a result of the dinner with the Garys, who said, hey, wouldn't it be great if we put a station in Wheaton over here? So we'll have to, reroute that track just a little bit. And there you go. They turned up again to have dinner, and I like the look on Ogden's face there. And Gary, because of Gary's mill out there. So moving closer, DuPage County, or the people of DuPage, and I should say that the county was created in February of 1839. The legislators had been elected back in 1836. It was a part of Cook County, and hence they had representation primarily from the Naperville area. And so the Napers, who are in the state legislature, would like to see the county, a separate county created. Abraham Lincoln, among others, would like to see the state capital moved from Vandalia to Springfield. And the Napers said, well, we'll vote for that if you vote for the creation of DuPage County. And consequently, they got the votes they needed, and state capital moved to Springfield, and DuPage County became a new county, separated from Cook County, just to tell you that. But the population that's moving in, these very first settlers that I'm naming to you are primarily from New England, and specifically from Vermont and upstate New York specifically. So they are already tending to be somewhat abolitionist in their mindset. They're products of that Second Great Awakening, especially in those areas, burned over district and other areas up in that region, and are heavily imbued with this sense of right and wrong through that. The other settlers that are coming in, like the Fischers, are coming from what is now Germany. There's no united Germany at that point, the Germanic states, but they are coming in also. Either the earliest ones are devout Lutherans, and also subscribe to the fact that the slavery is wrong. And so they're certainly anti-slavery in general, and some of them are even outright abolitionists. And so, if you can see there, those red lines, hopefully the red kind of stands out on the map. Those are routes of what we would refer to as the Underground Railroad, as enslaved persons are seeking to make their way to freedom across these states to get to the Great Lakes and then on to Canada. Some of those routes, I don't know if you can see on that map, would follow along, get to the Illinois River there, follow that up, and then come into DuPage County there in some cases from the south. So here are 3 places in DuPage County. The one here closest to me, that's Sheldon and Harriet Peck. The Peck homestead is still there in Lombard. If you haven't visited, it's a great place to go and visit. The oldest house in Lombard. And Peck was very outspoken. He was an agent for the Western Advocate, which was an anti-slavery newspaper, and had many escaped slaves stay at the house there and in a barn on the property there. The one in the middle, that's Pierce and Lucy Downer's home that I showed you. That's still there in Downers Grove. They also served as a stop. And then you have the Blodgett home there. And there's the faces to go with those names. But to talk about Sheldon Peck, if you're unfamiliar, Sheldon Peck was originally from Vermont, then lived in upstate New York, and he was a self-taught artist, what we might call a folk artist. And you can see his paintings there in the middle. His paintings were known around here after he moved here, and he served as a painter, a portrait painter. But for probably a century after that, his paintings weren't very much of a priority until they turned up again and were put into the museum at Colonial Williamsburg, and he's considered one of the finest folk artists in the United States. From right here in DuPage County. Here are their two sons, Charles and John Peck, who grew up here, and they left some interesting things about enslaved African Americans who are on the Underground Railroad staying at the home. But in 1849, I'll just throw this in, they decided to leave and go to California for the gold rush. But what do you do after you don't strike it rich in the gold rush? Well, if you're Charles, you come back, go into Chicago, and you establish the School of Design, which would become the Chicago Art Institute of Chicago. Major institution in DuPage County here is Wheaton College. It's around from 1853. It's originally called the Illinois Institute. First president is Lucius Columbus Matlack, but the school doesn't do very well after its first few years. One, they create something called the Perpetual Scholarship to try to bring in more students. Unfortunately, at the same time they do that, there's the Panic of 1857 and a recession there in the late 1850s. So consequently, now they're already short on funds and were short on students. Now they're getting more students. But the students are arriving. Someone would buy this scholarship, and because it says perpetual, what they meant by that was scholarship for that student. But parents were buying it maybe for a child who's too young, and then an older child from another family is showing up and saying, I'm here on so-and-so's perpetual scholarship. And so now there's these more students showing up, and consequently the school isn't doing well, but the Congregationalists and the Methodists in the area will actually come together. That's what's now called Blanchard Hall, and that's the oldest building there on the campus. I know that photograph is from just a little bit after in the 1870s, but you kind of get a sense of what it still looked like out there. But I bring this up because they brought in Jonathan Blanchard as the second president, the first president under the name of Wheaton College, an outspoken pastor, especially when it came to abolitionism. He had been the president over at Knox College in Galesburg and most likely had been asked to leave by the administration there because of his use of these college buildings there as stops on the Underground Railroad. Something that the administration there preferred not to become involved in politically with the Fugitive Slave Act. And he wound up leaving that position, coming here and being outspoken about that in terms of not only his teaching of the students, but his preaching there in the Wheaton community. And of course, this is the major issue leading towards the American Civil War. And Illinois will actually be a focus just before the war in 1858, because this senatorial campaign will take national precedence. And so Abraham Lincoln from here in the state is challenging Stephen Douglas, who's running for re-election as senator. And you all know that there's a series of debates, and one of the major things in the debates has to do with the expansion of slavery, right? The spread of slavery into Western territories and the concept of popular sovereignty, as Stephen Douglas has brought that up, having authored the Kansas-Nebraska bill. And of course, Douglas lives at this point, he lives in Chicago. He has his house in Chicago, well, just south of the city limits at that time, but what's now on the south side of the city of Chicago. So we have this other connection to the immediate local area. Though Stephen Douglas will win that re-election to the Senate, it does set up, in hindsight, it sets up Abraham Lincoln for this run for the presidency. And where does the Republican Party, of the new Republican Party of only a few years, choose to hold their convention for 1860, just their second presidential campaign that they're running in, right here in the city of Chicago. And they build that giant building you see there, the wigwam, with people going. And I'm sure you're familiar with the story that David Davis and his other managers decide not to try to push for Lincoln to win on that first ballot, but by going to the other delegations independently and saying, would you vote, for him as a compromise candidate after, if your candidate doesn't win. And so they're able to get enough votes in the convention doing it that way. Of course, one of the best things is they have people outside with those, trees that they had just cut down and said these were rails that Honest Abe had actually split back in his days, in southern Indiana and southern Illinois, and they carry them in, holding them up in front of the crowd, and everyone starts cheering inside that building. So here's the presidential ballot in terms of the nomination for Abraham Lincoln for president. And people here in DuPage will campaign. There's a picture of the Wide Awakes. I'm sorry I couldn't find one directly here. That's in Connecticut, the Wide Awakes. But up there, that sketch up in the top left, those are the plowboys from Downers Grove that went around on this wagon with a giant pole with an American flag on it going around in the county out here and in this area out here campaigning for Abraham Lincoln. The people here had actually surprisingly split their votes early on. I mean, some people had voted for a Democratic candidate in the previous election, Buchanan, but the other vote was actually split. Some voted for Fremont, but some voted for the Liberty Party that was around and some smaller anti-slavery candidates as well. It was already sort of divided at that point, and so it's sort of an easy move towards the Republican Party at this point. And there you can see the red for the Republican Party in this map. As you know, it's a four-way election. Douglas running, but also Breckinridge running on the Democratic side, Bell for the Constitutional Union, and Lincoln winning that election in 1860, which brings about the actual crisis of Civil War, the secession crisis that winter, and then the firing on Fort Sumter there in April of 1861, where we'll go on our tour in just a couple years when we see that. But how did the people react here? Because we're talking about the real history here, but I want to break down that wall. We're talking about right where we're sitting right here in DuPage County. Well, Cyrus Wirt Litchfield from Cottage Hill, which is now Elmhurst, walks into Chicago already on April 19th of 1861, and he enlists in Barker's Dragoons company there in Chicago, making him arguably the first man from DuPage County to enlist that early in the conflict. On the bottom part here, you can see a list of individuals who also went in. This is for Company K, specifically of the 13th Illinois that was already raised here. And yes, Merritt Hobson is the son of Bailey and Clarissa Hobson there. And Edmund Page married one of the Wheaton sisters. So, who else is in the 13th Illinois? Captain Walter Blanchard, his son Corporal Franklin Blanchard, and Private William Blanchard. Again, you should recognize that last name here in DuPage County. So they're coming out of the south part of the county here, would be associated with Downers Grove. They're going to participate in, well, I should go back. They'll participate in several battles. Walter Blanchard will actually be killed in 1863 in Missionary Ridge. So here's some of the initial reactions right away. As the Naperville Sentinel calls out on May 2nd, if we have a man in our midst whose heart does not beat true to the Union, let us know who it is. And over there in York Township, a resolution was passed by the people of York Township. Let every man, every loyal person have a flag flying on their premises. And I thought this was just a good quote by Private Robert Hale Strong, who went to one of the early recruiting rallies there. You can see wrote that GF and his father blew the fife and beat the drum and exhorted the men to rally around the flag. For all of their exhortations, GF and his father did not do any rallying themselves. That photograph there on the bottom is a photograph of Churchville. Anybody been over there? That's right where Fischer Farm is. That's the south edge of Bensenville, the north edge of Elmhurst. The photograph was taken essentially standing on what is Grand Avenue, looking north on Church Road. And that's the reason that little area is called Churchville. You can see the two churches are dominating, and on the left-hand side there, if you can see just beyond the church in the foreground, that's the one-room schoolhouse that I teach in. That's the Fischer one-room schoolhouse built in 1851 in that photograph. And then just beyond that, which you really can't make out in the photograph, standing near the road there, beyond that would be a general store that was operated by the Fischers. And hence that little group of cluster of buildings was called Churchville at the time. Well, we have another regiment here, the 8th Illinois Cavalry. How about that? Probably our most well-known, and they're the regiment that participated in the Eastern Theater, of course, in those major battles and campaigns of the Eastern Theater. And up there we have William Gamble, who went on not only become a colonel, but he started his career there as a lieutenant colonel in the 8th Illinois Cavalry before ultimately going on to command the brigade. Many of you are probably familiar with his portrayal in the movie Gettysburg, right? If nothing else. But his house at this point was in Evanston there, and that's on the campus of Northwestern University, and was being used by the anthropology department there. But that big boulder over on the right-hand side as you look there, that's one of the places that still remains. That is Camp Kane, where a lot of the training was done. That is out in St. Charles. That's in a park there in St. Charles, where the regiment was first mustered in and did some of their initial training. Companies were drawn not only from the north, what would be sort of the north side of Chicago and North Cook County, someone like Gamble there from the Evanston area, but troopers were drawn from DuPage County as well as into Kane County. Where are they most famously known, and who's their most famous person in the regiment, quite possibly around here? Well, time a young man. I don't have a young photograph of him there in the center, but Lieutenant Marcellus Jones, and I know our esteemed president couldn't wait for me to have a picture like this, even though it's a DuPage County presentation, is probably celebrating back there in the painting of the first shot. So DuPage County can claim, and there, of course, some of you may know that Marshall Krolik had authored an article several years back called "DuPage County Fires First Shots to End the War." What's the title of his article? I'm just telling you what the title of the article was, whether you. But that's a painting for those of you a little less familiar. Just to be clear, that is to depict the opening shot at the Battle of Gettysburg on the Chambersburg Pike just west of town, about 7:30 in the morning, when that advanced picket line, vedette line out there right along the pike, just on the north side of it, first sighted the head of A.P. Hill's Confederate Corps coming down the road. And Marcellus Jones had been in charge of that vedette post along with a couple others, and he was just riding up to that one to check in with them. Private Levi Schaefer was about to fire his carbine when Jones hopped down from his horse and said, "George, let me have the honor of starting the ball." Ran over, grabbed the carbine, and fired that first shot before then riding back in to report and send it up the chain of command that the Confederates were indeed coming. I also put up there from the 8th Illinois Cavalry, Walter Kennicott. Walter Kennicott, the Kennicott family, I know, is Glenview. If anybody has been to the Grove is a National Historic Landmark for other connections, really through sort of National Geographic and exploration type things. But the Kennicott family, Walter Kennicott served here, as you see, in the 8th Illinois Cavalry, and they do have his personal effects in their collection over there. They're not often out. I was privileged to have been there visiting with the curator of their collections on a day she happened to have these things out, and I saw his saber and other items that are there. And so if we can claim that he fired the first shot, in a sense, we could say that unfortunately he was the final casualty. As you see, they're killed on July 7th at Falling Waters, one of the few casualties there at that point in the pursuit as they're back to the Potomac. So interesting that this area, this immediate area, has these two connections from the 8th Illinois. Here's another one crossing over the line a little bit between here and Chicago. From the 72nd Illinois, this is Anson Tyler Hemingway, who lived in a couple different places before he ultimately opened his real estate practice in Oak Park after the Civil War. But he served in the 72nd and would have been at Vicksburg. He also was good friends with Dwight L. Moody. If you're familiar with Dwight L. Moody, founder of Moody Bible Institute, was an evangelist and a pastor, and himself served with the YMCA during the Civil War, and was there in some of the Western theater battles. And if that name is familiar from Oak Park, it should be because his grandson is none other than Ernest Hemingway. The 132nd Illinois. And you say, what's the 132nd? That's an awfully high number. This was a 100 days regiment called in when Grant was trying to forward as many men to the front as possible and create these 100-day regiments to take the place of some of the garrison duty or stationed at forts and things like that, because he's removing the garrisons, the regiments that have been stationed there, bringing them to the front. If you can't get any more men to enlist that way to send them to the front, at least will they go into a 100 days unit and take over some of these behind the lines duties. So the 132nd Illinois is one of those that is created for this point in 1864. The gentleman in this picture here is the first African-American student to attend and graduate from Wheaton College, and he will serve in this 100 days regiment, the 132nd Illinois. You'll see that he becomes a pastor there. He actually becomes a lawyer, and unfortunately, he will, not that late in his life, commit suicide, so that's kind of a sad part, but but we do have a distinction of having a gentleman of African American descent in the 132nd Illinois, being the first graduate from Wheaton College as well, first African American to graduate from Wheaton College. Who else? Well, in Chicago, we have a place called Camp Douglas, right? It was an induction center, so that's the modern term that we would use initially, where regiments were mustered in, did some training, but it also converted over to be a prisoner of war camp. At times, it held some Union regiments, like those that had surrendered at Harper's Ferry that Rob Girardi has told us about, who often protested having to do other duties and tore barracks down and demolished things during their stay. But it also held Confederate prisoners, like John Hunt Morgan's, several of his cavalry raiders and others that were captured, obviously before that, prisoners taken from at the fighting at surrender of Fort Donelson. He's not the first commander here, but Colonel Benjamin Sweet will be placed in command here later in the war. As you can see, May of 1862. He's actually the last commander, May of 64 to May of 65. He's the one in command during some of the concerns over a conspiracy in 1864, the fall of 1864, with the Democratic Convention. They choose to hold their convention in Chicago in 1864. And so there's concerns also about a conspiracy that they'll try to get the prisoners out, and there's some plans to try to get prisoners out of Camp Douglas and do some other things in the city of Chicago. And so he's on high alert during some of that time. Bring him up because he will be in, if anybody knows where Sweet is, will be living, that's Lombard, or what we call Lombard, Babcock's Grove. Here we have Mason Brayman. Anybody heard of Mason Brayman before? Yeah? All right, only Bruce, really. Mason Brayman. You could maybe argue that he's not directly from here. He's from all over the place in a way, but briefly lived in Warrenville, and Warrenville likes to claim him. He was born in upstate New York, 1813. You can't make this up. 7 months after he was born, the British Army was advancing across the property that his parents lived on. They literally flee with the baby in their arms ahead of the advancing redcoats there in 1813 during the War of 1812. But anyway, he does a whole bunch of things that you can see on here. In terms of living here in Illinois, his connection living in Springfield, he writes out every law. He was delegated to write out every single law that had ever been passed by the state of Illinois from 1819 until that point in 1844. Write out a single compendium of every single law prior to the state constitutional convention that they were going to have. But by going through that, and he got it done single-handedly, writing out every single law like that. After going through, he realized that there are duplications of laws that actually contradict one another, that were created in individual circumstances. I know, right? And being the the conscientious person he was, he brought this up to the legislators and said, maybe you guys need to deal with this, these issues that I found. And so that was part of what was addressed in that constitutional convention at that point. As you can see there on the next one, if you can read that, I know the print for this one is a little bit smaller, but if you can read that from where you are. When Abraham Lincoln serves his single term in the House of Representatives, he actually rents his house to the Brayman family. And the Braymans actually live in that house while the Lincoln family is in Washington during that single term. He was a lawyer. He also argued a lot of cases, often against Abraham Lincoln, interestingly enough. When he worked for the Illinois Railroad, he's the one who retained Lincoln to work for the railroad. He originally was with the 29th. He enters the war to be a officer in the 29th Illinois, but almost immediately he's reassigned to be on the staff, serves as an adjutant and different roles, adjutant general for General McClernand in his corps. But that doesn't stop him here at the Battle of Shiloh, and that quote there has to do with a soldier who rode home to his daughter, and that's what's depicted on the cover of the book. I couldn't find a good painting of this, so I just had to take a picture of the cover of the book, but it says that, they were trying to get this line there at Shiloh, and he simply rides out in front. He rides right down the line, rallying everybody. And the soldier said, "But it's your father." So none of us were really surprised with his white beard streaming out behind him, you know. He did all sorts of things, as you can see there. But nonetheless, before going in, he has this connection to Warrenville. 33rd Illinois Regiment, also raised here with companies from Illinois. The 33rd, as you can see here. Now, they're a pretty well-educated regiment. If you look here, officers who are graduates of Illinois State, 2, graduates of Yale, 2, graduates of Knox College, 2, graduates of Illinois College, 2, University of Michigan, 1. So their officer corps alone in the 33rd was fairly well educated, along with many of the others in the ranks, and hence they were called a school teachers regiment for a while. Also some companies being raised in the Bloomington Normal area there. But several men, as I said, companies here from DuPage, the 33rd, would serve through the entire Vicksburg campaign. And yes, none other than Frederick Fischer is in the 33rd, Company B of the 33rd Illinois. Augustus Fischer is in another regiment, the 105th Illinois. He goes in the next summer in 1863. Companies B, D, F, and I, 403 men come out of DuPage County. The 105th is on railroad duty in Tennessee in the summer of 1863. They will be called forward to the front for the Atlanta campaign in 1864. Fight their way down towards Atlanta, and Augustus, well, we'll pick up with Augustus. This regiment is in many ways initially, well, these companies at least are furnished by Thomas Barber Bryan. His wife there, Jane Bird Bryan. He finances this. There's also a building in Chicago called Bryan Hall. But where does Bryan live? Cottage Hill, which is Elmhurst, actually. He will have a residence there, funding this regiment. But picture of his wife there is a painting. That's by Healy. You may know his painting, The Peacemakers, the famous painting of Grant and Farragut and Sherman and Lincoln on the steamboat there in their conference, that final conference just before the war ends. So G.P.A. Healy is a noted artist with Elmhurst connection, and there he is, and there's that famous painting that, or one of his more famous paintings that I was describing, and hence his connection to Elmhurst. And we recently, a little over a year ago, we acquired at Elmhurst History Museum an original painting by him. It came up on eBay during the pandemic. The curator of collections saw it, investigated a little bit, and said, "I think that's the real thing." Told our director. The director simply started calling the foundation members, and said, "Hey, we should invest in this." And that has just recently been put on display in our second floor gallery. If you want to come and see that painting at the Elmhurst History Museum. We have Medal of Honor from DuPage County. Yes, we have medals of honor from DuPage County in the Civil War. Wells Blodgett, again, from the Blodgett family in Downers Grove. He received his Medal of Honor for action at the Battle of Newtonia out in Missouri, so out in the Trans-Mississippi on September 30th. With the aid of a single orderly, he captured an armed picket of 8 men. Why his orderly didn't get to have a Medal of Honor too, I don't know then. But, but you can see sort of a unique battle. You have a couple Native American, and the painting is depicting that there in the front on the Union side there as well in this battle out in the Trans-Mississippi. So, and there's a wonderful painting of Blodgett if you go over to the Downers Grove Museum, hanging in the dining room. They have the full-size portrait of him in his uniform hanging there. Beautiful piece if you go over there to see it. Do we have another one? Yes, a man by the name of George Houghton, who's actually from Nova Scotia, who has wound up in Brookfield, Illinois, and thus is serving in the 104th Illinois. And he wound up doing an action. It was one of some men in an action who was protecting a bridge there, and received a Medal of Honor for his action in defending the bridge. Another Medal of Honor here now, Newton Thomas Gold for his assault at participating in the charge at Vicksburg. And remember, the 33rd Illinois is, of course, at Vicksburg, and they're right at the railroad redoubt in that assault at Vicksburg. So those are men right from here. So we try to put that in context. We think about the battles sometime as a sequence of events in the war, but remember those men who are in those regiments. And it's not just men from other places, and people from right here where we're living that are in some of these very climactic moments of these battles here. But let's talk a little bit more specifically on this end then. So those are the battle connections. These are the places where the men are. They are at these known battles, you know. They are at these battles. They are participating in what would come to be some of these climactic moments of the war. But what about it here? Well, we've got to support this effort just like anywhere else. We've got to make sure we can pay for these things. And as the Naperville Sentinel there tells us, you know, for those who are not going to bleed, you know, on the field of battle, let's bleed at the pocket, since we've entered a contest in which blood must flow like water. And so they do start raising money. Not only is there a federal bounty that's offered or a state bounty, but counties will begin doing that, and DuPage County is no different. And you can see how that went up. They started it in July of 1862 with that $50, and then it would go up from there. $60 in county orders at 7% interest, although you notice that it becomes at county orders, and they don't always have the cash to pay for this up front. So it's through these notes or these promises, but they keep increasing interest rate on that, and they keep raising the sum of what they'll be paid. So let's take a look at this. How many men from here served? As was mentioned before, the total number from Illinois that served, over 64% of the military-aged men in Illinois would serve in Union regiments, over 259,000. But here in DuPage, we're very close to that. If you look, out of 14,000 people in the population, 2,433 men of that age, and 1,524 from DuPage County here will serve. That's over 62.5% of the male population from DuPage County. So a small rural population out here in these towns, but they will serve. And yes, the native-born actually outnumber the foreign-born, which in this case is almost entirely German due to the settlement in DuPage County. A handful of Irish, handful of French, actually, interestingly enough, the gentleman from Canada, but most of them will be German, but you can see the percentage there that served. So what does this do when 2/3 of the men are removed? Well, I showed you this one a little bit in my home front presentation, but I'll show you here for DuPage County. Farm laborers were typically commanding $12 a month, and I broke that down for you so you don't have to do the math, $3 a week or 50 cents a day. But by 1864, they're commanding as much as $30 a month or $1 a day. So that wage has significantly gone up because many of these young men cannot afford to buy property. I don't expect you to remember my slide from that presentation for those of you that saw it, but I had a slide that showed comparison prices of property in New England, for example, to the Midwest at this point. And the prices, while lower here in the Midwest, were still fairly expensive. And so it's going to be hard for a younger person to buy that property. Farms are getting split up, especially in New England, let's say. If the younger generation has moved west, they can't necessarily buy that property, and so they'll start their career as a farm laborer. So many men find themselves in a situation like this. Another source of labor is, of course, women here in DuPage County and in other places. Women will go to work. They've already been working on the farm, but they can go to work for pay, and they'll be paid as early as 1862, 50 to 70 cents. So they'll be getting almost $1 as well in terms of their labor during the course of the war. Or as you can see on the right-hand side there, machinery that's being made by this point in time. Reapers, mowers, things like that, if it can be afforded by the farmer, is something that can also be used to make up for this lack of labor in terms of male population not being present. But what are some of these farms? Well, if you haven't heard me say it before, the theme I never stop repeating is the dairy farms. Welcome to Fischer Farm, kids. No. And yes, that is Fischer Farm there on the far left. I thought that was a perfect thing when the sheep came to the door and peeked out at me like that. So I couldn't have staged that better if I were a professional photographer. Actually, but these are all farms right here in DuPage County. Also, Vulcaning Heritage Farm over in Schaumburg. If you've not visited there, they depict the 1880s. If they haven't lost their horses or their cow out to what is that, Plum Grove Road, that they have to go out and get it every so often. No. But these are all right here in DuPage County. So this area is primarily dairy farming. Initially, there are some other types of crops that are grown here, and the very earliest settlers may have thought about doing that. But being immediately outside of a larger city, Chicago, you have to do these type of products this close to the city. You worry about spoilage with things like that. Butter, eggs, cheese, milk, that sort of thing has to be produced close enough that it be transported on a regular basis multiple times a week for direct sale to the people who are going to buy it. Because for the first time, and I know I'm oversimplifying a little bit, so forgive me, but due to the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, people in Chicago are doing things for the first time where they're not growing or producing food, right? They're building railroad cars, they're loading and unloading ships, they're working at Montgomery Wards, Marshall Fields, things like that. So they're not producing this food for their families, and they have to buy this now on a regular basis. And so things like dairy products have to be close. So this area is dairy farms. Everywhere you look, it's dairy farms. The grain and the other types of farms are grown a little bit further out. But as I said, cheese. So here's one. We're going to add, right? So in 1860, there's 100 workers in manufacturing, and obviously that's not just giant factories by the standard that's used. That could be smaller shops. But 10 years later, in 1870, there's now 200 workers here in DuPage County and 58 manufacturing firms. So even though the Civil War is going on, or because the Civil War is going on, this is one of the things that will change. We will see manufacturing like this double. Obviously, almost everybody out here was farmers. 100 men were working in manufacturing, and by 1870, that's now doubled. In 1860, there's 0 cheese factories. By 1870, there's 6 cheese factories, along with the one you see up in the left-hand corner there, August Ashy, right in downtown Bensenville, that wonderful metropolis. Come and visit me sometime. No. I'll show you where that was. Between 1860 and 1865, there's 46 new businesses in DuPage County. 5 of those are established by women. So if we were to go back, though, how is the county affected by the war? Well, not everyone, not all the men who leave will come home. And this is a letter, and it's one of the first letters I ever read. One of the things that Miss Leslie gave me when I portrayed, I was portraying the sergeant. I was not portraying Augustus Fischer, but Augustus Fischer would be killed in action outside of Atlanta, as you can read there. He was on the picket line in charge of the pickets, and he was killed there. This is Herman Fischer, who is a younger brother. He was here working on the farm, and there's a wonderful collection of letters that survive, copies of which they are at the Elmhurst History Museum. I also have several copies, not the originals. I have copies of the letters in my own personal collection that were written, but it's an interesting, it's wonderful to be able to see, because we have the letters both coming from the farm, from Herman, the younger brother, their father, Henry Dietrich, as well as Augustus and Frederick, who are in the field, writing back and forth from right here in DuPage, so you can get that sense with these letters and read them. And there's Frederick Fischer, along with his wife, Martha Struckman. And you see here, he would become the DuPage County clerk after returning from the war. He does come home. He serves all the way through the Vicksburg campaign. He'll serve in Texas, actually, and he will come home. He will go on after studying there to Oberlin College for a year. He's going to go over to Germany, University of Leipzig and Heidelberg, where he will get a medical degree, come back, practice briefly in the Cincinnati area before moving to Elmhurst. Unfortunately, that's one of the landmarks we have lost. His home was in downtown Elmhurst, out of which he practiced. It was a beautiful home that was torn down several years ago now, but that was right there in almost what is downtown Elmhurst. But I bring that up for this reason, to conclude, and I know I've gone through a whole lot of things, but it's to try to give us maybe a different perspective on the way we think about this area and see some of these connections and some of these names and some of these faces from right here where we live, and their involvement in the war and how things were impacted or changed here. But Frederick Fischer, as you see, he would become the DuPage County clerk, and he would say afterwards, if you ever read what he wrote, he said afterwards that he just wanted, initially it was the most wonderful job he had, especially after coming back from the war. It was a very nice experience. It was a nice way to transition back to help the people of his county and to do this job, and people were very friendly. what happens is, and I have to do another talk on this at some point, Sean, to really, really examine this. But the DuPage County seat was in Naperville originally. That had been the town. But for some time, there was a movement to have it moved. And ultimately, there would be an election to have it moved. The election results would be contested, and they were challenged. And however, the result of the election was that it needed to be moved to Wheaton. But there was a challenge filed. And Frederick Fischer thought about it, and he thought about what the law would say. And he said, well, since there's a pending legal challenge, I should not take the initiative and move the records from the existing county courthouse to the new location until this is decided through a legal process. The legal process will go on for some time, often in the one committee, because there was a committee, and there's a lot to this, but from northern townships who wanted it moved to Wheaton, southern townships that did not, southern townships that would abstain from the meeting sometimes, or the northern townships would abstain from the meeting, so there was never a quorum, so this committee could never do any work. So things were also, caused to go out. So he decided that it wasn't up to him as county clerk to move it until this had been decided. But some people in Wheaton get together and decide that they're not going to wait, and they will take matters into their own hands. And very possibly, Marcellus Jones is in that group of individuals from Wheaton, Glen Ellen area, who decide, Danby Station as it was called then, who decide that they are going to do this. And they sneak very early one morning before dawn over into Naperville to break into the building, steal the records, and then remove them to Wheaton. And ergo, when the people of Naperville wake up, it'll be a done deal. And they'll just have to come to Wheaton to do their business. All of their businesses we've had to do ever since. But Frederick Fischer is caught in the middle of this after this happens. But it's an amazing story. There's some crazy things that happen. They should make a movie about it. Like the first person to actually discover it is a 5-year-old who couldn't sleep. And so he got up earlier ahead of his parents, and he'd slipped out of the house, only to discover people climbing in the window. And he has the presence of mind, instead of going back in, to run to the church. And he jumps on the rope, and he's too small, and he's riding up and down on the rope, ringing the church bell. It wakes the people of Naperville up. And then the question arose of how did they get in? Well, the window was unlocked. Well, they said that a man in Naperville had actually turned traitor and left the window unlocked. And his fiancée then returned his ring and said that she would no longer marry him for being a traitor to Naperville. And there's a whole lot to this. There's a whole lot to this story. But we no longer have that courthouse. We have this courthouse that stands for us in Wheaton today, but it's a product right at this time, just in the immediate aftermath of the American Civil War, with possibly at least 2, if not more, veterans from DuPage County who were in the Civil War involved in that too. So even if that building is non-historical building, it's representative of historical struggle at the time of the Civil War. Thank you.
Jonathan. John has always been a great public speaker. I've seen him speak many times. It's always so much great information, especially in our local area. There's always a lot of pearls of wisdom. We'd like to take some questions now for John. Do you have any questions?
For the war, do you have any idea, if any, and if so, how many of the escaped slaves decided this was a better place to stay here? Instead of going all the way home.
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't specifically looked at something like that. I would have to say that very few, before the war, very few stayed. Illinois, DuPage County as a whole stands out differently. You'll have to go get a copy of my thesis for you to fill in on that information. That's a separate talk. But DuPage County and Lake County are strongly, not just anti-slavery, but in fact abolitionist, really, in their sentiment. sort of more than may have been typical. And so I understand your question, but Illinois, unfortunately, not to its credit, also had essentially a reverse underground railway running in Illinois. Obviously, the fugitive slave law was in effect, but Illinois had its own, its own policies on returning escaped slaves. And the policy in Illinois was, even for sheriffs, Illinois county sheriffs, were paid more. The fee was a higher fee if the individual was returned to slavery versus if the person was either shown to be free, a free person if it was determined they had papers or they had been manumitted or free. The fee paid to that county sheriff who was involved in it was a lower fee in those cases than it was if the individual was returned. More of their expenses were reimbursed and they got a higher fee. So consequently, that doesn't exactly, in that environment, make certain sheriffs want the case to turn out that way. So there's a lot of other places in Illinois. If you read an article, there's an article in the Civil War History Journal by Leslie Schwalm from a few years ago, and he talks about the reception of African Americans in the upper Midwest. Now he's looking specifically at Minnesota, Iowa, and Wisconsin. I don't think everything in his article completely stands up, but he tries to make the point that regardless of what I said here tonight, that every white person in these states was completely anti-black and wouldn't allow them to live here. I mean, there is some sense of, for the rest of the population, even if they were anti-slavery, it doesn't mean you're full-fledged civil rights in that sense. And also, these areas are just emerging from the frontier in a sense. They've worked hard to create these homes from the wilderness in just the years just before the war. They've barely been establishing their community. They haven't really been able to enjoy the fruits of this, so to speak, by the time the war begins. And now all of their efforts are going into the war. All of this stuff is going into the war, right? Where's all their product being shipped to? All of this is being taken into Chicago, and it's being shipped by rail then down through Indianapolis to Louisville, in most cases, Louisville to Nashville, to the Western armies, where it's then dispersed. Even the Sanitary Commission, the Northwestern branch, which is incredibly successful, based in Chicago, they have their local representatives that feeds from Wisconsin, from Iowa, from Northern Illinois. It's all being funneled in and organized through Chicago, Northern Indiana. It's all being funneled here, and then that's all being shipped out. So almost all of their work and labor is going into this, and to some extent, then they're not ready to share with neighbors of another color when they've barely been able to enjoy the fruits of their labor in creating their homes here, some of them. Now, some people like the Pecks were 100, well, as much as could be in that time, were very much more progressive in that sense and believed fully in equality of rights for African Americans. The Blodgetts did as well. As an example, once when a sheriff had recaptured some escaped slaves and passing by through Downers Grove, he saw Mrs. Blodgett out. He asked her for a drink of water. She said yes and handed it to the two slaves in front of him. So, there's definitely different responses. But even if there weren't, I think the fugitive slave law and other things were still a concern. And the idea was still for most of them to try to get to Canada. So there were a few. I mean, the gentleman that you saw at Wheaton College, because he's in the middle of that abolitionist environment and he's sort of completely protected at the college. So that's a little bit of a different sense. But I would say very few early on. Right. Yeah, the number would be small. Yeah. Lake Forest had a guy who was an escaped slave, and he stayed there in Lake Forest. He started his own delivery business, actually, even during the war in Lake Forest.
I didn't follow your slide about the county bounty and the escalation of rates. Say more or explain that. I didn't get.
Oh, yeah, sorry. No, that was just to show briefly how that went up over the course of the war. Initially, there was no specific county bounty offered. Not until the summer of 1862 was that instituted by DuPage County in particular. And they started paying that $50 bounty if you volunteered. Remember, they do want to avoid the draft. First, it's that enrollment in the state militia. The act in 1862, the July Act of 1862, is to be enrolled in your state militia. So it's like a quasi draft. The federal government is not actually drafting. They're trying to get the states to make sure that all of their men have been enrolled in their state militia, because they were supposed to have already been enrolled in the militia, right? Your pre-war setting, all your male population should have been enrolled in the militia. So that act was under the guise of getting everybody enlisted in your state militia, so that when the federal government needed more men, they could take one of your state regiments, which is what they had already been doing, right? These were state regiments that they then federalized, into federal service like that. So they do the $50 bounty because they want to avoid that. They don't want, we don't want people to enter that way. And then the same thing. That's part of the reason why, after the Enrollment Act in March of 1863, that is a draft that will go into effect. We don't want men to be drafted. But also, we need to supply for their families, right? These men are supporting their families. Most of them are farm families. If you take the male labor away from the family, you're impacting it. We've got a lot of men already gone by that point, and the later the war gets, DuPage is sending a lot of men, and so these men want to make sure that their families are provided for. And so that's used as another sort of enticement to get these men to volunteer. In fact, by the end, individual townships within the county will also begin taxing themselves to try to raise even another fund for men specifically from that township to get an additional bounty, which I did not put on that slide because that varied by township and came in at different points. So it was for a combination of reasons, both to supply for the families, to support the families, but also to avoid the draft. And DuPage County did manage to get through the entire war and did not have a man enter as officially as a draftee in the war. DuPage always met its quota.
Draft system administered at the county level?
Well, it was really I was really at each state had a provost marshal assigned to it and an assistant provost marshal. And then there were districts, and the districts corresponded to the congressional districts, right? Am I right? Right. It corresponded to the congressional districts, and it was apportioned that way. And so then within each congressional district, you had to raise that quota of men. So the sum would be the quota for that state. And there were local individuals from that district, usually, judges or other people from that district who would serve as the draft representatives then in that case. Go ahead, Mr. Savage. Let's try. Go ahead. No. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Think again, John. Again, John is always the first to volunteer. So again, thank you for the presentation tonight. It's just so cool to have a local topic for us as we vary our topics from month to month. And speaking of our topics, next month's speaker is Bjorn, who's going to be speaking about Shiloh. So surprisingly, it's another great public speaker. He spoke many times to us here at our roundtable, and of course he's at the Abe Lincoln Bookshop, and of course he's also a part-time park ranger historian at Shiloh. So we're really welcoming him as we come into the 2025 year. And everyone have a great holiday. Good to see everybody. And we will see you next month. Thank you. Once again, great job. Really, I love your speaker. You're a very good public speaker. Yeah.
Good.
I really mean that. So I like the way you. What's the right word?